In addition to being a successful actor and director, Rob Reiner tragically passed away in 2025. In this video, you'll discover what life was like for this artist.
Legendary filmmaker Rob Reiner and his wife lost their lives inside the one place meant to be safest, at the hands of someone who knew them well. Rob spent decades telling stories about family, love, and human connection, yet inside his own home things were unraveling. His son Nick's long public struggle with addiction had already strained the family, but nothing prepared anyone for the explosive argument the night before the killings or what followed. Now, investigators are revisiting old statements Nick once made about his father, remarks that suggest the warning signs were there long before everything collapsed. The tragic incident. Rob Reiner and his wife, Michelle Singer Reiner, experienced the last evening of their lives on December 13, 2025. That night, they attended a Christmas party hosted by Conan O'Brien. It was a familiar setting with friends, colleagues, and longtime connections gathered for what was meant to be a relaxed holiday event. But at the party, something was clearly wrong. Witnesses later told investigators that a very loud argument broke out between Rob and his son, Nick Reiner. The confrontation drew attention. This was not a quiet disagreement that went unnoticed. Voices were raised. Tension was visible. People nearby could hear it, and several guests noticed the tension immediately. Several attendees later described Nick's behavior as alarming. His actions stood out enough that people remembered them clearly the next day. One guest described him as freaking everyone out, a phrase that would later circulate as investigators began piecing together what happened in the hours leading up to the deaths. Rob did not disengage from the situation. Witnesses said he confronted it directly, attempting to manage the conflict rather than avoid it. Michelle remained close to him throughout the exchange. The two stayed together, moving as a unit rather than separating or deferring the situation to someone else. Not long after, Rob and Michelle left the party together. Their departure appeared intentional, as if they wanted to remove Nick from the setting and keep him close rather than let the situation continue publicly. To some guests, it looked like parents stepping in, trying to regain control of a difficult moment. Later that night, Rob Reiner had spoken by phone with Eric Idle. The conversation centered on future work, including ongoing discussions about Spinal Tap 2. According to Eric, the discussion was focused on projects ahead, not personal matters. There was nothing about the exchange that suggested distress or urgency. Rob was engaged, forward-looking, and talking about work that still lay in front of him. However, while speaking to friends before that night, Rob reportedly admitted something that would later take on heavy meaning. He said he was afraid of his son. This was not said casually. It reflected genuine concern, not anger or frustration. At the time, it sounded like a parent worried about behavior he could not fully manage. But what happened after they returned home would reflect their fear. Sometime in the early morning hours of December 14th, Rob and Michelle Reiner were killed inside their Brentwood home. The Los Angeles District Attorney later confirmed that the deaths occurred before dawn. Authorities stressed that the exact minute could not be determined, but the time window was clear. At around 3 p.m., their daughter, Romy Reiner, who lived across the street, went to check on them. But when she entered the house, she found both parents unresponsive, and she immediately made the emergency call. Paramedics and officers from the Los Angeles Police Department arrived shortly after. Both Rob and Michelle were pronounced dead at the scene. The house was secured, and investigators quickly classified it as a homicide investigation. Investigators immediately noted that they found no signs of forced entry. Doors and windows were intact. There was no evidence of a break-in or struggle visible from the outside. This immediately narrowed the scope of the investigation. Whoever committed the attack was either allowed inside or already had access to the home. Neighbors were interviewed as part of the early investigation. Several reported hearing no alarms, no shouting, and no unusual noises during the night. In a residential area where sound travels and security systems are common, The absence of disturbance stood out. Investigators also noted that movement through the house could only be done quietly by someone familiar with its layout. The lack of external disruption suggested the attacker knew where they were going and how to move without drawing attention. As police worked to reconstruct the timeline, attention quickly turned to Nick Reiner. According to investigators, Nick left the home shortly after the killings. By 4 a.m. on December 14th, he arrived at the Pierside Hotel. Hotel staff later told police that his behavior did not raise concern. He checked in calmly. He spoke normally. Nothing about the interaction suggested panic or distress. But when investigators examined the hotel room after Nick left, they found blood inside the room, directly linking him to the crime. This discovery connected the hotel's stay to the events at the Brentwood house and placed Nick firmly within the unfolding timeline. The stay itself was brief. Nick did not remain there long. He left within hours, reinforcing the sense that he was not settling or hiding, but moving from place to place. Later that day, surveillance cameras captured Nick at a gas station near Exposition Boulevard and Vermont Avenue. The footage showed him walking in, buying a drink, and leaving. He did not rush or appear disoriented. Again, the behavior appeared ordinary, a sharp contrast to what investigators believed had already occurred. By the evening of December 14th, police had narrowed in on his location. At approximately 9:15 p.m., officers arrested Nick near Exposition Park, close to the University of Southern California campus. Multiple police vehicles surrounded the area at a busy intersection. The arrest unfolded in public view. Despite the heavy police presence, Nick did not resist. He complied with officers' commands and was taken into custody without incident. By the end of the day, the picture was becoming clearer. A public argument, a quiet house, no forced entry, a rapid departure, and a trail that stretched across the city. But what remained unanswered was what exactly had happened inside the home, because the most disturbing details were still ahead. And when investigators began analyzing the bodies, the scene, and the timeline together, what forensics uncovered would change how this case was understood. The investigation and forensic analysis. Once the Brentwood home was secured, forensic teams moved in to answer the most important question left unanswered by witnesses and timelines. When did Rob and Michelle Reiner die? And how did it happen? The medical examiner began with time-of-death analysis. Without surveillance inside the home and with no clear time tied to the attack itself, investigators relied on physical indicators from the bodies. Two of the most important were rigor mortis and lividity. Rigor mortis refers to the stiffening of muscles after death. Lividity refers to how blood settles in the body once the heart stops. Together, these indicators allow forensic experts to estimate how long someone has been deceased. Based on these findings, the medical examiner concluded that both Rob and Michelle likely died in the early morning hours, roughly 12 hours before their bodies were discovered. This timing aligned with what investigators already suspected. The attack happened while the neighborhood was quiet, when most people were asleep and unlikely to notice anything unusual. After this, investigators turned to examining the injuries themselves. Both victims suffered multiple sharp force injuries, a clinical term used by forensic pathologists to describe wounds caused by a sharp object, such as a knife or a similar weapon. The injuries were also close range. There was no evidence of distance or separation between the attacker and victims. This means the attack was not carried out from afar. It required physical proximity, direct contact, and sustained movement. What stood out to investigators was not just the presence of sharp force injuries, but the number of them. Repeated wounds suggested the violence continued beyond a single moment. This was not one strike followed by retreat. It unfolded over time, even if that time was brief. From a forensic standpoint, repeated injuries often point toward sustained action rather than impulse. Investigators do not draw emotional conclusions from this, but they do draw legal ones. Sustained action supports the idea of intent, that the attacker continued rather than stopped. Based on the forensic conclusions, Nick Reiner was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count for each parent. First-degree murder is the most serious homicide charge reserved for killings prosecutors believe involved intent and, in many cases, premeditation. But the charges did not stop there. Prosecutors also added special circumstances to the case because it involved multiple victims. Under California law, special circumstances elevate a murder case into the highest legal category. This classification is not symbolic. It changes everything about how the case proceeds. With special circumstances attached, the possible sentences become the most severe allowed by law. If convicted, Nick Reiner now faces either life in prison without the possibility of parole or the death penalty. The Los Angeles District Attorney made it clear that their decision was the most serious charge the office can bring. This statement signaled confidence in the forensic findings and underscored how the evidence fit the legal threshold required for such charges. Investigators had finally established a firm timeline, a clear cause of death, and injuries consistent with sustained close-range violence, combined with the absence of forced entry and the movement evidence gathered afterward. What remained was for these findings to enter the courtroom. When Nick Reiner appeared before a judge for the first time, the setting, the restrictions, and even what he wore sent a message that stunned many watching. And that first court appearance would mark another turning point in a case already defined by shock. The shocking court appearance. On the morning of December 17, 2025, Nick Reiner was brought into a Los Angeles courtroom for the first time since his arrest. Until that moment, the case had existed mostly through police briefings, charging documents, and fragments of information released to the public. This hearing marked the point where the case formally entered the court system. From that point forward, everything said and recorded inside the courtroom became part of the official legal record. The setting was tightly controlled. Court officials barred cameras from the room, and no live footage was permitted. There were no television crews inside, no broadcast equipment, and no public feed. Only a limited number of reporters were allowed to observe the proceedings, along with court staff and attorneys. The restrictions were in place before Nick arrived, and they remained throughout the hearing. Nick entered the courtroom under escort. Deputies accompanied him as he took his seat at the defense table. He was wearing a harm prevention smock, issued during early custody in serious criminal cases. The garment was visible, but it was not addressed by the court. The judge did not comment on it, and no explanation was offered during the proceedings. The hearing moved forward without reference to it. Once the court was in session, the charges were read. Nick Reiner was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. 1 count related to the death of his father. The second related to the death of his mother. The charges were read in standard legal language without elaboration. Nick reportedly remained silent. When the judge asked whether he understood his rights, Nick responded briefly, confirming that he did. That was the only time he spoke during the hearing. He did not enter a plea. He did not ask questions, and he did not address the charges further. Nick remained focused on the proceedings but did not interact beyond what was required. After the charges were entered, the court moved to scheduling. Nick's attorney requested that the arraignment be postponed. The request was granted. The judge set a new date of January 7, 2026, allowing additional time before Nick would be required to enter a plea. The decision was made without objection from the prosecution. The hearing continued without delay. Only then did observers fully register who was standing beside Nick. His defense attorney was Alan Jackson, a lawyer whose name alone carried weight. Jackson was very familiar with high-stakes cases and public scrutiny. Over the years, he had represented defendants in cases that unfolded over months and sometimes years, under constant media attention. His client list included Kevin Spacey, Harvey Weinstein, and Karen Reed. The choice of Jackson immediately shifted how the case was perceived. This was not a provisional defense. It was not a short-term legal arrangement. It was a signal that the defense expected a long process, extensive filings, and close examination of every element the prosecution planned to present. As the hearing ended, Nick was escorted out the same way he had entered, quietly, without comment. No statements were made to the press. The prosecution offered nothing further. The defense declined to speak. The courtroom cleared almost as quickly as it had filled. But outside the courtroom, the conversation was just beginning. Within hours, attention turned away from the hearing itself and toward a different question: how this defense was being paid for. Legal professionals noted that cases involving 2 first-degree murder charges, particularly those with special circumstances attached, rarely resolve quickly. They involve extensive forensic review, expert testimony, and prolonged pretrial motions. Costs accumulate rapidly. Estimates place the likely expense of such a defense well above $1 million even before a trial date was set. Nick Reiner did not have a publicly documented income or career that would readily explain that level of expense. As a result, speculation followed almost immediately. Some observers suggested that funds tied to the Reiner family estate could be paying for the defense. Others questioned whether estate assets could be used in that way. Estate law experts pointed out that the issue is complex. In some cases, shared or inherited assets can be used to cover legal fees. In others, such use can lead to disputes or court challenges from other beneficiaries. None of these issues were addressed during the hearing. The court did not ask about funding sources, and the defense did not volunteer information. Despite the lack of confirmation, the discussion spread quickly. Public opinion split. Some argued that access to experienced legal representation is a basic right, regardless of the charges. Others expressed discomfort with the possibility that family-linked assets could be used in this way. The debate unfolded outside the courtroom while proceedings inside remained strictly procedural. Within the family, the situation appeared equally unsettled. Reports circulated suggesting that some surviving relatives hoped Nick would receive psychiatric treatment in addition to facing criminal charges. However, these reports were not confirmed through official statements or court filings. From the prosecution's perspective, the position remained unchanged. Prosecutors maintained that the evidence supported first-degree murder charges. They pointed to the violent nature of the attack and to Nick's movements after the deaths. Based on those elements, they argued that the case met the legal standard for the charges filed. Because special circumstances were attached for multiple murders, sentencing options were already defined. If convicted, Nick Reiner faces life imprisonment without the possibility of parole or the death penalty. No alternative sentencing options were available under the current charges. Outside the courtroom, the case continued to develop. Investigators remained at work. Attorneys began preparing for the next phase. Information that had not yet entered the public record continued to circulate privately among those involved. And while the courtroom itself had been silent, it became increasingly clear that Nick Reiner would not remain silent forever. Because in the days that followed, attention would turn to a statement Nick himself previously made, one that reshaped how the case was discussed. Nick's shocking revelation. Nick Reiner once said he didn't bond with his father growing up, and that distance shaped how he saw himself inside the family. He described feeling like an outsider in his own home, watching connection happen around him without knowing how to step into it. Rob Reiner shared clear interests with his other children, sports, activities, and routines that created natural time together. But Nick didn't fit easily into those spaces. While the household was stable and supportive on the surface, Nick felt disconnected, like he was living alongside his family rather than with them. Rob Reiner was not an absent parent in the traditional sense. He was present, successful, engaged, and deeply invested in his family. But success can create distance without intention. Nick grew up in a world shaped by work, schedules, and pressure, a home where love existed, but connection did not always land the way it was meant to. And as Nick's sense of isolation deepened, he began pulling away instead of finding his place. Without a strong bond to ground him, he drifted toward peers and environments that offered escape rather than structure. It was during this period that he turned to illegal substances, first as experimentation, then as a habit. By the age of 15, his addiction had escalated to the point where he entered rehabilitation. This was not a phase handled privately or quietly. Treatment was sought early, repeatedly, and with urgency. The substances involved were not minor. Nick later acknowledged using substances that carry high risk and deep dependency. Over time, his addiction followed a pattern familiar to many families dealing with substance abuse: brief improvement, followed by intense relapse. During those relapses, Nick's life became unstable. He experienced periods of homelessness, moving across different states, including Maine, New Jersey, and Texas. These were not extended travels or career moves. They were stretches without permanent housing, structure, or consistency. Despite the instability, Rob and Michelle did not disengage. In multiple interviews over the years, they spoke about their son's struggles without avoiding responsibility. They repeatedly funded treatment programs, paid for rehabilitation stays, and remained emotionally involved. Friends of the family later described constant effort, phone calls, support, encouragement, and patience that did not disappear after setbacks. At one point, Rob attempted a different approach. Rather than separating work and family, he brought Nick into his professional world. In 2015, they collaborated on the film Being Charlie, a story drawn directly from Nick's experience with addiction and recovery. The film did not present addiction as resolved or overcome. It depicted relapse, resistance, and the difficulty of sustained change. During the period surrounding that collaboration, Nick showed signs of stability. He was working consistently. He had structure. He was spending time with his father in a defined setting. Those close to the family noticed a difference. The chaos that had marked earlier periods appeared reduced. There was focus and routine. Unfortunately, that stability did not last. Nick relapsed shortly after, and his entire progress unraveled. He returned to patterns that had defined much of his adult life: instability, distance, and unpredictability. Each relapse made recovery harder, not just physically, but emotionally, for everyone involved. In the years leading up to the tragedy, concern within the family reportedly grew. The cycles were repeating faster. The stakes felt higher. What once seemed manageable through intervention began to feel volatile. Rob and Michelle continued to support Nick, but support does not erase fear. According to people close to them, they began to worry not just about his recovery, but about Nick's and their own safety. Nick's admission that he never fully bonded with his father began to resurface in this context, not as an excuse, but as a window into a complicated relationship shaped by addiction, guilt, effort, and disappointment on both sides. By the time of the Christmas party, the strain between them was not new. The argument that night did not emerge in isolation. It followed years of effort, relapse, reconciliation, and unresolved distance. The family had been navigating those dynamics long before the final night. Nick's struggle with addiction had shaped decisions, relationships, and boundaries over time. His sense of disconnection, first described in childhood, continued into adulthood, intersecting with substance use, instability, and repeated attempts at recovery. That pattern remained in place in the years leading up to the tragedy. Family members' confession. In the days following the deaths of Rob Reiner and his wife, the first public response from within the family came from their surviving children, Romy Reiner and Jake Reiner. They issued a joint statement acknowledging the scale of the loss and the shock surrounding it. The message did not attempt to explain events or address legal questions. It focused on grief. They described the deaths as devastating and conveyed the depth of pain the family was experiencing. Rather than framing Rob and Michelle only as public figures, they emphasized their roles inside the family as parents and as the emotional center of their lives. The statement made clear that this was not only a public tragedy, but also a private one, unfolding inside a family suddenly fractured. Alongside that acknowledgement, Romy and Jake thanked the public for the outpouring of support. Messages had arrived from across the country and from around the world. Friends, colleagues, and strangers alike reached out, offering condolences and memories. While the family recognized that support, they also asked for privacy as they processed the loss and prepared for what lay ahead. No further statements followed. There have been no interviews, no appearances, and no attempts to clarify or respond to speculation. The family withdrew from public view, allowing the legal process to move forward separately from mourning. Behind the scenes, a private memorial was held for Rob and Michelle. The gathering was not open to the public and was kept intentionally small. Attendees included close family members, longtime friends, and trusted colleagues from across Rob Reiner's career. There were also no cameras present and no public program released afterward. Those who attended described it as restrained and personal. It was not a celebration of career milestones or awards, but a moment for people who had known Rob and Michelle for decades to come together quietly, away from headlines and court filings. Across Hollywood, reactions to this tragedy have continued to surface. Actors and filmmakers who had worked with Rob Reiner over the years shared tributes and memories. Kathy Bates, who collaborated with Reiner early in her film career, reflected on his presence as a director and collaborator. Kate Hudson acknowledged his influence across generations of performers. Nick Robinson, who worked with Reiner later in his career, spoke about his guidance and generosity on set. The tributes varied in tone but shared common themes of steadiness, respect, and a sense that Rob Reiner created spaces where people felt safe to do their best work. Many emphasized his ability to move between genres without losing clarity of voice or purpose. And, as the industry reflected, attention naturally returned to Rob Reiner's body of work. He directed films that became cultural landmarks, not through spectacle, but through character and restraint. The Princess Bride remains a touchstone for audiences across generations, balancing humor, sincerity, and fantasy without irony. Stand By Me was often cited as one of the most honest portrayals of childhood and loss ever put on screen. When Harry Met Sally redefined romantic comedy by grounding it in conversation rather than cliché, colleagues noted that Reiner's legacy was not built on volume, but on consistency. He was known for showing up prepared, trusting actors, and avoiding excess. His films did not rely on shock or spectacle, they relied on people. Michelle Singer Reiner's role was also acknowledged, though often more quietly. She worked largely outside the spotlight, supporting philanthropic causes and remaining deeply involved in family life. Those close to the couple described them as partners in every sense, moving together through decades of work, parenting, and public life. As tributes continued, the contrast between Rob Reiner's public legacy and the private circumstances of his death remained unavoidable. The same industry that celebrated his contributions now watched as the legal case involving his family unfolded. For the family, there was no separation between those worlds. Public remembrance existed alongside active grief. Professional praise arrived as legal proceedings continued. The two realities overlapped, even if they were never addressed together. And as the legal process presses forward, the tributes and memorials serve as a quiet reminder that behind every charge and headline stood people who were not symbols or stories, but parents, partners, and friends whose absence would be felt long after the cameras moved on. What do you think? Did Nick Reiner commit the crimes, or is he being framed? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.